Oh my God, I hate that we're gonna forget that. We heard that voice. All right, beautiful. All right, welcome everybody. Welcome, Eliot. This is going to be such a fun salon. Before we dive in, I am going to let Eliot kind of introduce himself and talk a little bit about kind of what he's excited to discuss today. And then after that, because we're a small enough group, we can go around and kind of popcorn it to each other and do little introductions. So we can talk about, we can say like who we are, we can say our names, where we're calling from, what brought you here today, why are you all here? And then pertinent, to this conversation, I'm really curious to know if you have any favorite speculative or sci-fi books, movies, whatever it might be. And if you want an extra little like bonus question just to start sparking things, I'll throw in the question of what is your relationship to the future as a concept, thinking about the future, and throw that in there to start planting those seeds. But as you let those kind of like marinate, I'll let Eliot kind of introduce himself and start to set the tone for today.
Sure. I'm glad we're starting with easy questions, right? Just like really small, basic logistical stuff. Yeah. Well, Mariel, first of all, thank you so much for making this happen. I'm here today because Anna reached out to me, who's one of the founder of II, and I don't know, we wound up talking for a few months, and she got me so excited about what II does and sort of bringing salons to the internet. And I think it's a really powerful thing. I think that it's especially powerful in a time when a lot of online conversation can be really fast and shallow, when we're all sort of like dipping in and out of feeds all the time, and you don't get to go deep, you don't get to have a lot of context. And I feel like that's sort of exactly what this org exists to change. And so as I mentioned, it's my first time, but I'm really excited to have it be my first time, and I'm looking forward to learning from folks who've been in it before, because I love the salon format. I think that culture as a whole is really a single extended conversation, whether you're a poet or a software engineer or anything else. And so I think this is a great way to sort of celebrate that. Just as, by way of introduction, I'm a novelist. For those of you who aren't familiar with my work, I write speculative fiction. So my 10th novel came out last week. It's called Reaper. And all of my books are near future thrillers. They sort of riff on the world we currently live in and sort of change fun things about it. And I've always been fascinated by how technology is sort of the power and consequences of technology, how it actually impacts our lives. And I found that fiction is a really powerful format for exploring some of those implications and thinking about how the world is changing and thinking about what that might look like going forward. Before I started writing books, I actually, in school, I studied international relations. And so it was really unrelated to, or I guess related in a certain sense, but very indirectly to what I wound up doing. After school, I worked in a series of tech startups, and some of that was probably what folks are familiar with when you say the word tech startup, like software. But actually, the first company I worked for did plasma arc gasification technology. So it was waste to energy. We were building machines that were the size of 40-foot shipping containers, where you could dump trash in one end, and then it would turn it into plasma and then convert that plasma into clean electricity. So I've had these really weird sort of experiences working on hardware and software and a lot of things in between. I founded a company with a few friends and then worked for a venture capital firm for a few years, where I was working in many different startups, helping build our portfolio companies. And during that time, I sort of had an idea for a book that I wanted to read, but I couldn't find. I've always been a huge book nerd, and I'm guessing I'm not the only one in this Zoom who probably shares that. Yeah, exactly. Like I was like the kid where my parents would like bring me to the library or the bookstore, and then I would hide in the stacks so they couldn't bring me home, right? So I've always just loved reading. And so I had just an idea of, for a book that I wanted to read, and I, sort of tried to find a book that was like it and couldn't. And so that's when I started working on my first novel. I was like, well, if I can't find this book to read, maybe I'll give it a shot at writing it. And so that was my first book. It came out in 2014, and then I basically wound up having so much fun with it that I kept going. So sort of interestingly, I've always thought of myself as a reader first and a writer second. I didn't grow up dreaming of being a writer. I fell into it for fun, and now it's really sort of changed my life in a wonderful way. And so now, yeah, I write novels like Reaper, I write speculative fiction, and I also I am a huge reader of speculative fiction. So I send a newsletter that's we have a few thousand subscribers that's often recommends books with speculative fiction. I regularly interview other speculative fiction writers like William Gibson or Daniel Suarez, Kim Stanley Robinson for my blog. So that's sort of my sort of view on this topic. And it's something I love. And I'm always excited to talk about things I love with other people who love similar things. So I'm really excited to share some of the weird little lessons I've learned on sort of speculative fiction, writing it, reading it, messing around with it, talking about it, and also to learn from you. Because being in the middle of a book launch, Mariel and I were just talking about this before everyone else joined. It's always a little crazy when you have a new novel come out, because I'm in the middle of doing all this like promotional stuff and media and interviews and all that. And a lot of the things around a book launch are one to many, right? Like I'm doing a radio interview. There are a lot of unseen and visible listeners on the other end. And something I'm very excited about for this conversation is that it's going to be the opposite, that I'm here as much to listen as to run my mouth, and that this gets to be a real genuine conversation, and that it gets to be really intimate. So I'm really excited to be here, and I'm really excited to connect with all of you.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that. With that, we can start introducing ourselves and popcorning around. So I'm going to kick it off, and maybe we can start with Michael. If you want to kind of introduce yourself, tell us where you're from, what brought you here, any favorites in the canon of speculative and sci-fi, and then you can kind of pass it on to somebody else.
Yeah, that sounds great. I am currently phoning in from my grandpa's house because I'm headed on a plane like maybe 30 minutes after this ends. So if there's ever a moment when I have my camera off, it's probably because I'm making sure my bags are packed, something like that. But I'm mostly here, which is great. I am totally a big book nerd, like seems like probably everyone else here. My favorite authors, I guess, to be honest, Eliot is one of my favorite authors, and I'm not just saying that because he really is. His books, I think for me, gave a much different flair than a lot of the science fiction I read. Growing up, never found myself liking Star Wars or Star Trek like a ton. That wasn't like my blend of science fiction that like really got my intellectual brain stimulated. I found it being more Neil Stephenson or William Gibson, or from like the indie side, because I'm really passionate about a lot of indie authors. A.G. Riddle has been someone who I've really admired their work, or even Matthew Mathers. So I read pretty extensively in the genre, definitely not as extensive as Eliot, because I subscribe to his newsletter, I like read his books. I'm like, wow, didn't even know this existed. That's another good recommendation. But I attend college during the most of the year. Now it's summer, so I live in Charleston, South Carolina, and I'm really interested in working on internet startups, writing books myself, and thinking about the future with really interesting people. My relationship to the future is interesting because like Meta, I think about the future all the time, it's super fun and it's something that excites me, but also scares me. But that's why it's like fun to write stories about and fun to think about building products and things that maybe try and bring that future to life for better or worse, defined by whom, lots of questions. But for myself individually, the future is something that I think I struggle with because as being a writer who thinks about the future, a lot of my work, like in startups, is thinking about the future. I study neuroscience in school, so that's very much like, where is that going? And a lot of that actually brings me out of the present moment. And as like fun as the future is, I oftentimes find that like the richness of life is in the moment and being grounded in the present. And that's something I struggle with. So I work on meditation and a lot of like things that are not related to future. That's like actually what I sometimes try and do in my off time, because if I read a science fiction book, sometimes I'm trying to have an off day. It's like, I'm way too excited and I need to like bring it down a notch. So yeah, it's a short story about me.
Thanks so much for that. Feel free to popcorn it off to anybody else in the room.
Oh, I'll do Nikki.
Thanks. Nice to meet you guys. I'm Nikki. I'm calling in from Malta. It's a little island. It's hot, very hot right now. It's like 24 degrees, and it's 8 p.m. So yeah, this is not my first salon. Stumbled across the community towards the end of last year, and it's great for just, you know, long form conversation, discussions. I've discovered so many people. I didn't know of you, to be honest, Eliot, until I saw a salon pop up, and I'm like, holy shit, loads of cool books and like interesting topics. I'll definitely be checking some stuff out. Books. So I've recently, like the most recent books I've read were Contact by Carl Sagan, which was my first Carl Sagan book. That was very enjoyable, and The Black Cloud by Fred Hoyle. What I enjoyed about both of those is that I could, like, while it's talking about scientific sci-fi topics, I could see myself, like, you know, in the research lab, or it was very grounded. So I want to explore more of that sort of sci-fi where it's like researching or thinking about specific things, but still in the present. So something I can relate to more. I did really enjoy reading The Metamorphosis of Prime Intellect, which is like a little short stories. It's available for free. You can link it in the chat. My relationship to the future, I'm going to live in it. So I want it to be better and improve stuff. There's like I'm a software engineer as a job at the moment. I was working in some like biotech startup before on brain, nerve computer interfaces. I spend a lot of time thinking about different futures and different technology. I've always loved tech, and I love seeing like what's on the edges and what's coming up. Think a lot about, there's like a mixture of the like psychedelic space and sci-fi and neuroscience and software and computing. An amalgamation of that. Looking forward to this conversation. Thanks. I'll choose Andrea.
Hey, I'm in Gibraltar, so I'm not sure if you guys know where that is. It's right at the bottom of southern Spain. Small little place, 30,000 people, 2.5 square miles. So I've been in the community now for a few months, and I've been on 2 salons, I think, which is terrifying because I'm a raving introvert, and you have to have your camera on, you have to be talking, and that's always intimidating. But Eliot, I'm always excited when I discover new authors, and typically sci-fi and speculative fiction is not something that I've really read. I'm almost exclusively contemporary fiction, crime fiction. So I started reading when I was 35, so I started very late to the whole reading party, since I left school, and I read The Persuader by Lee Child. So it's a Jack Reacher novel, and I just fell in love. And I just, since that day when I was 35 years old, I've never stopped reading fiction. So I've read pretty much everything in the crime fiction space. But I was really excited when you popped up on the radar with in this community, and so so I signed up, and I watched some videos on YouTube. Typed in your name because I'd never heard of you before, and in my business, we publish stuff online, courses online in the marketing space. And one of the things that we do is whenever I'm reading a book, I always type in book, author, and then I'll watch videos of the author doing interviews. And I find that that's a nice gateway before I read their book. So then by the time I read the book, I have a nice understanding of the topic, of them. And so I did the same with you, and I found there was a Google Talks that you did. This was a while back. And again, I'd not read any of your work. So I picked up your trilogy, which was your first one, but then I thought, actually, if it's really good and I love it, then I'm lumped into 3 books. So I started reading Cumulus, which was maybe last week, and I'm absolutely loving it. I'm really enjoying it. So I'm 40% into it. The writing's phenomenal. I'm really, really enjoying it. So I think that was your 4th book.
Yes, that's right.
Which was your first standalone novel. So I thought, well, that's my gateway. Then I'm going to start there. Then I'm going to read your brand new book, which I purchased already. So I'm really enjoying it, because it is just far enough into the future where it feels like it's grounded in our reality, as opposed to Star Trek. That's just too far away, and for me, there's a disconnect there. So I'm really enjoying it, and I'm feeling grateful that I found this.
Well, thank you, and I'd love to hear what you think of Cumulus when you finish. So make sure to follow up.
Will do. So it's me, Travis, if he's around. Or Parker, I think I can see Parker.
Yeah, I can go, but it looks like Travis just turned on his camera. So
there we go.
Hello, everyone. Sorry that I'm kind of in and out. And all hands sort of town hall got scheduled at the same time as this after I'd already RSVP'd. But I really want to be here. This is more interesting to me. I'm based in Washington, D.C. by way of Atlanta, originally from the San Francisco Bay Area. I work in strategic foresight. That's my day job. I got into this space around 2015 through the Strategic Foresight MBA program at California College of the Arts. And so I have sort of maybe an opposite problem where I tend to gravitate really strongly toward nonfiction when I read. And so I'm always having to push myself to I need the more divergent creative thinking as inputs as well. And so, of course, when I saw this pop up, this seemed like a great opportunity. Also, coincidentally, I ended up with a research topic on geoengineering on a sustainability board. So the timing could not be better for this.
For those who may not be aware, I have a novel called Veil that is literally about, the whole book is about a solar geoengineering scenario. So I think that might be what Travis is referencing.
That's exactly right. Yeah. So that's my quick intro. Parker.
Great. Yeah. I'm Park. I live in New York City. I lived here for like 8 years. I don't know that that's necessarily super relevant, but it's worth giving everyone context, I think it's always interesting. This is my first salon. I'm very excited by it. I just like have completely consistently missed the boat on being able to sign up for them, but this is something I was like, I can't miss this one. And part of the reason for that is, so I work in a speculative field. I've never heard of strategic foresight. That's a very cool field. I work in crypto. I think a lot of people have a lot of misconceptions about crypto and the idea that it's this like speculative financial environment. And it's really not. I literally work on the infrastructure side of it. I work on what are called validators, and they're the ones that actually attest to transactions being added to a public ledger. And so the great advantage of this is actually not that it is a technology for speculating on the value of the networks that you're creating, but actually literally coordinating otherwise uninterested parties, like parties that aren't necessarily aligned in what their interests are, and coordinating around one act, which is to add to this ledger and attest to transactions. And so the effect of this is that the philosophy of our space is very coordination based. It's very much about aligning incentives despite diverging backgrounds. And that narrative has escaped our space yet sufficiently. It's very much on the ground floor with all the people who are actually building the technology. It's a huge unifying factor for all the work that we do. And so like I'm just very driven by that perspective. But how I got here is that I've been a big science fiction fan for a very long time. And like I've been reading science fiction and speculative fiction like my whole life. But I also just very quickly realized that one of the greatest values to like science fiction in general is extrapolation, is sort of thinking about these like potentials that can come about. Part of my intellectual career has been like deep study into complexity science and an interest in complex outcomes as a result of simple initial conditions. And just sort of, I found it really fascinating to think about extrapolation as a realm of possibility, and then to evaluate it through probability, and eventually, hopefully, to inspiration. And so, you know, a lot of my favorite books kind of like are about bending your mind around the possibility. So, you know, like anything from like Severance, which I actually have up on the shelf right here, by Ling Ma, which is about like an apocalyptic disease that takes over the world, and this woman's perspective of being like an Asian American woman trying to live in society as all the social structures that normally would have limited her as a person like kind of fall apart around her, to, you know, things like When We Cease to Understand the World by Labattu, which is a really great book. I highly recommend, which that one's kind of like somewhere between fiction and nonfiction. It pursues like a lot of like mathematicians and like their very strange minds as they continue to explore concepts that you know, like tap into something much bigger than themselves, and like what happens to the brain when you reach something that is like you mentioned a little bit ago, Nikki, right? This like psychedelia, you tap into something much bigger than you, and like what words can you apply to that? What scenarios can you use to describe that? And so like I love things that do that. Of course, like I feel like everyone in this room is likely to have read Remembrance of Earth's Past, the trilogy by Cixin Liu. Right, it's The Dark Forest. You haven't read it, you should definitely read it. It's excellent. I can drop it in the chat, I guess, after I'm done speaking. But those are also amazing. It's like what happens when you interact with like another species somewhere else in the universe, and like it's unfolded some like really incredible concepts about like answers to some great paradoxes and how it is that science has actually thought about our place in the universe. And I guess the last thing I'll say about that too is like, for example, specifically in our space, just like to bring it back to what it is that I work on. So I work for a validator, but I'm also very much a big part of what's called the regenerative finance community. What we're trying to do is realize Kim Stanley Robinson's goals. and ideals for what you can do to finance or to financialize actually saving the planet. And so like there's been a lot of different attempts throughout our space to like kind of work on this. One of these is like that's brought up in Stanley Robinson's Ministry for the Future is this idea of essentially like in creating a deflationary black hole for carbon credits so that they go up in value, that as it in turn forces companies to actually hold themselves to a carbon standard. I actually find that really compelling and very possible. And it's something that a bunch of different people in our space are like actively working on, is buying all the cheapest credits and seeing what happens. So without going on any longer, I think the future is something that is achievable. So that's how I think about a lot of this. Like I love science fiction because it thinks about possibilities, and the future means something possible to me. Is there anyone else that hasn't spoken yet?
I'm gonna jump in real quick. I love this. I love all of this. I'm feeling like maybe it's because my legs are starting to fall asleep, but I'm feeling very tingly like in my fingertips, and I get so excited when I hear. It's clear that everybody here is already just like tapped in and like on the same page in some way, and that's so exciting to hear. I'm currently sitting on the floor of my childhood bedroom in Massachusetts. I'm visiting family for a while, and I'm coming back here for I was class of 2020, never got a graduation, so they delayed it by 2 years. So that's what's happening this weekend for me. So that's kind of what I'm here doing. Usually I live in San Francisco in the Bay Area. Currently working part-time for startups. I've kind of worked for startups for a while now, slowly trying to kind of break out of that, do more creative technology as opposed to just, startup desk work. It's so funny. I also majored in neuroscience, like Michael. I also worked on brain-computer interfacing for a while, Nikki. And so I worked on like fish biomimetics, and I was in a lot of research labs that were doing like frontier, very like sci-fi, like what you would read about in sci-fi kind of like literature. And while I was kind of in these labs and in these environments, I spent a lot of time also exploring just like creative technology and did a whole deep dive and had a whole phase of fascination with like the transhumanist movement and the cyborg movement, and Neil Harbison and Moon Ribas, and just the whole kind of like culture around like actualizing kind of like these like sci-fi speculative fiction visions. I was much more of a fantasy kid growing up. Like I loved watching the Star Wars and Star Trek and all that, but I think I loved fantasy especially. And I only ever really read fiction. I've only recently come to start reading nonfiction, because for me, it is exactly that. I am most captivated by, there's just like imagined worlds. I love rich world building. Like I could read a book that's just world building, that has barely any dialogue. Like if you're just painting a picture of a world, for me, like that's something I love, and that's something that's so abundant in kind of like sci-fi and in speculative fiction. And so so I'm really excited to be here. I'm really mostly going to be kind of like facilitating. I'll be closer to like the participant end, I think, of things. But I think to kind of like kick us off, and we can take this in a million directions. I don't know if there's anything that was brought up in our introductions that maybe Eliot wants to respond to. But I'm really curious on, I think one of the first questions that I had for Eliot that I think was also kind of brought up through a lot of our introductions just now, is this idea of kind of like the role of science fiction and speculative fiction in terms of how it like reorients our minds and reframes like the present moment. I know that there's this kind of idea of sci-fi. I read this wonderful quote and this kind of theory of like cognitive estrangement, and this idea like with art in general of making the familiar unfamiliar enough to make you re-engage with it in a way. And I think there's a similar thing, right, that we've kind of brought up that happens with sci-fi, with speculative fiction, and we've had this beautiful discussion when we kind of just met and had our short call, Eliot, because one of the things that you do is you like this like near future, like highly plausible kind of speculative fiction. And you were discussing kind of the ways in which grounding it just enough in reality so that we can latch on to something, but then kind of twisting, perverting, tweaking it in certain ways that like cause us to, again, like reframe the way we think about things that have otherwise been normalized or standardized or taken for granted. So I'm curious kind of how you, if you could just like speak more to that kind of like cognitive reframe.
Sure. Yeah, happy to. I can already tell that we don't have enough time because everyone has brought up so many sort of interesting ideas that I want to riff on and learn more about that I already know that. So we'll just do what we can with the time we have. Yeah, so first of all, as a writer and through meeting other writers, I found that like one thing that's surprising is how heterogeneous people's processes are when they write about the future or when they write imagined futures. Like people approach this in so many different ways. Like I have a friend who makes spreadsheets where every chapter, every scene, every beat is in a spreadsheet, color-coded with like timelines and milestones showing like exactly how much time he expects each scene will take to write. So he can open up the spreadsheet and tell you when the manuscript's going to be delivered, right? Like it's like completely organized. And then, someone already mentioned William Gibson, like Bill, when he writes a novel, he literally starts with the first sentence and nothing else. The only thing he's thinking about is like the words in that first sentence. And only once he has a first sentence that he feels like contains a book, does he move on to the second sentence, right? So it's like, it's like the polar opposite. And so, one thing that is sort of interesting is that, there's no right way to write about the future, or to try to imagine the future or try to develop, new ways to have strategic foresight about the future or to build the future. People are approaching in their own ways. But for me, when I approach a novel, basically I'm writing it for myself. I already gave the example in the introduction of wanting to read a book and then just deciding to write the book I wanted to read. And so when I write a book, I'm really just writing something I would want to read and hoping that other people might share my taste, right? That like others might be like, oh yeah, like I also want to read that book. And I am just totally fascinated by the present. Like there is so, like the world, reality is so rich, right? Like, and we all live in such a siloed pocket universe of our own, of our friendships, our like the rooms that we're all currently seeing each other in, right? Like we all live in our own little worlds. And there are so many of those worlds that are all connected across the planet we live on. And so I find that endlessly fascinating. That's why I read. That's why I read everything from scientific papers to poetry. And so when I'm working on a new novel, the way that it feels is not so much that I am either planning out a book or even planning out a future or even doing explicit world building, which some people like some writers like N.K. Jemisin, for example, she does these like really ambitious like world building efforts that then like sort of give her the background and the context and the basis for the story she wants to tell in that imagined world. But for me, the way that it feels for me is actually more like a DJ remixing songs. So, like I tend to think about, I'm like reading and collecting all of these dots, just like things that spark my interest, that make me want to go down an internet rabbit hole. And then I try to figure out how can I connect those dots? How can I take those ideas and like mix them together in a weird and provocative way, where I'm reaching for like the most, not for example, trying to predict the future or trying to even come up with something that is plausible, but coming up with a story and the personal world, the world building of the character, like what is the pocket universe they inhabit, that is most interesting. So that's what I'm trying to optimize for, is like, what is the most interesting way to remix all of this material that I'm collecting through reading, but also just through living, and like create a new world that has a lot of those elements, but there's all of these different tweaks. Now, I think there are a couple of different interesting angles to take with this. Like Nikki, you mentioned psychedelics and brain-computer interfaces and all that kind of stuff. One of the interesting things that, like, one of the things that I think is closest, the psychological experience that is closest to writing fiction is actually dreaming, right? So like if you think about dreams, it's like you have all this raw experience that your brain is taking in, and then when you're sleeping, your conscious mind, it isn't controlling, isn't doing the interpretation on that data anymore, and suddenly you get these really weird dreams, these that are taking what were these raw pieces of data that we have from experience and sort of just like stitching them together in random ways, right? In ways that often make no sense at all. And I think that I know that for me, I often find that like right when I wake up or right when I'm falling asleep, when you're on that liminal zone between sleep and awareness, conscious awareness, that like that's a really generative mental space. I know that we already mentioned William Gibson. He often takes naps during the day so that he can then write immediately before and after the nap, right? Because it puts you in this like interesting psychological zone where you're connecting things in different ways. And so for me, that's how a lot of speculative fiction feels. And to me, what is speculative fiction? So people have mentioned Star Trek and Star Wars and Cixin Liu's trilogy, right? Like we're already throwing out a bunch of like awesome, like really cool topics. And fantasy, Mariel, like as you sort of mentioned, right? And like to me, I tend to really love writing speculative fiction that takes the present and asks that like what if question. What if the world was different, right? Because to me, that's what makes it speculative. Like I actually love Star Wars, but to me, Star Wars feels like fantasy. It feels like we're in this like other universe. It's far, far away, right? A galaxy far, far away. But it feels like a pure story, like straight mythology. And when I think of speculative fiction, and certainly the books that I write, are more connected to reality as we experience it right now. They're actually more naturalistic. They're actually taking elements of our world and then stitching them together in ways that are just familiar, that are both familiar and surprising, right? That like give you a different, like a weird different lens on the world. And sometimes there are books that do that happen to be in the present, like a book that often gets compared to Stan's The Ministry for the Future, which Parker, you mentioned, is Richard Powers' The Overstory, which is, like wouldn't be shelved in the science fiction section, but if you read that book, it is totally speculative fiction, right? It finds that it gives you a new lens that allows you to see how strange the world we live in really is. Because it's so easy to sort of take the status quo for granted, the world we're born into, and speculative fiction can offer this gift to readers. That's one of the reasons I love reading it, that it gives you this new lens to throw over the familiar and make it surprising. So that's something I really love in speculative fiction. And that's how I often think about it as a category, is like it asks these fundamental questions about what if the world was different, right? Like what if the world was different? So that's a big piece of what I think about when I'm writing a new book.
I'm curious kind of within that, like for you personally,
Yeah.
I feel like that, like, what if, to me, that feels kind of like just everything, that's everything that all science fiction, speculative fiction needs to be. And that kind of feels like just the start. I feel like ever since the beginning, like we started with like utopian imagination, it was fundamentally like political, like people wanted to see things happen. Dystopian fiction was to get people kind of like uncomfortable moving, like doing things. I feel like so much of science and speculative fiction, it's never like purely aesthetic, and like it always starts with the what if, and there's always like the what if in the imagination. But I'm curious, like it feels like different authors have, bluntly maybe like different agendas, but different authors have kind of, it feels like different takes on or different opinions on maybe what they hope kind of like readers emerge with or do, you know, like after a book, or like what they do like then with that. And I'm curious if that question even like if that makes sense like for your writing, if that like resonates, and if so, like is like if there is an action bias, or like here's actually kind of like personally behind the scenes what I'm hoping this will instigate in people after the what if. I'm curious, like what is that for you?
Got it. Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I think that to start at the beginning, one of the things that always gives me inspiration when I'm working on a new novel is how weird the world is to begin with, right? So like, for example, right now I'm reading an amazing book called Debt that I would highly recommend. Do you have it there? Yeah, of course, Parker would have it. Like if you're working on currency related stuff. Yeah, it's so, I'm like 2/3 of the way through. Like, it's nonfiction. It will blow your mind in the same way that like reading the best science fiction stories do, right? Like it's a history of debt in human civilization, and how, I mean, almost everything from religion to slavery to sort of modern banking systems are all connected to this one core concept that basically we've been riffing on for like thousands of generations. So to me, that's where I start. I start by trying to almost like be the like the David Attenborough, like when you're watching a nature documentary and it's like, oh, like look at this, look at how these animals live in this really interesting part of the world. Like I try to look at my own home, my own life from that perspective, to take a step back from it and be like, wow, like humans do really weird stuff, right? And like so much of our world is social convention. So, you know, there are things in the world, like I have a glass of water here, like, you know, obviously that the glass itself and the forms it can take are determined by the laws of physics, but things that are determined by natural laws are actually like play a relatively small role in our day-to-day lives. Like so much of our lives, our governments, our companies, our work, the all hands that Travis is now dipping in and out of, like all of those are social inventions, even though they feel often as concrete to us as the glass of water. And so I always am trying to remind myself of that and to find new perspectives on it. And that's where a new idea for a book will emerge. That's where that what if questions tend to come from, right? And then like stacking them together. Now, you asked like, what comes next? So if the what if is sort of that like kickoff, where do you go from there? So and you layer on top of that, like, do you have an ulterior motive with, you know, in writing a novel, right? Like, are you writing it to sort of communicate a certain idea, or to you know, to promote an agenda, or to bring attention to something? And I think that there are writers that absolutely do that. They have a message and they are telling a story in order to share that message. And in that sense, I think that like I like the example of how, like, you know, stories can be Trojan horses for ideas, right? And like literally the fact that I can use the metaphor proves the point. Like a Trojan horse is a metaphor from a story told thousands of years ago, right? Like, and now we use it as a metaphor to communicate an idea of everything from a computer virus to something cultural, right? So like I think that stories can very much be vehicles for ideas. However, I don't set out proactively when I'm working on a novel to do that with intention. And the reason I don't is that I think that stories become vehicles for the ideas of the reader, not the ideas of the writer. I don't think that Homer was thinking about computer viruses when he wrote when he composed the Iliad, or that Virgil was with the Aeneid, where really the Trojan horse story came into full bloom. And I think that when you think about the history of stories, when you look at fairy tales and mythology, part of what makes those stories work is that people tell what makes a fairy tale is people keep telling the story for its own sake, right? It's the images, the symbolism, the relationships, the growth that is in that story makes you want to tell it to your niece, right? And then she tells it to her granddaughter or whatever, and like that story then spreads, and people sort of hitchhike their ideas on those stories. So if you look at the history of fairy tales and mythology, you can see that every generation interprets those stories with their own historical moment. So they all have completely different interpretations. So I think a funny example of this, Mariel, when we started this Zoom, you were like, I hate that voice of like the Zoom panopticon, right? Like we're all being recorded. Well, like what happened when Snowden had his revelations about the NSA, George Orwell's 1984 classic work of speculative fiction, like shot to the top of the bestseller lists, right? Like Orwell wasn't writing about 1984, let alone 2014. He was writing about England in 1948, right? Like that's what he was writing about. But the story that he made, the artifact, not his ideas, but the artifact of the story itself became a metaphor for state surveillance. That became a shortcut, an intellectual shortcut, where like I struggled to imagine how long it would take to have like an in-depth conversation about state surveillance prior to the publication of 1984. Like we use that book to like explain a really complicated social concept that if you were doing it without that book, like it would take hours just to like get onto the same page of like what you're even discussing. And so I think that's the power of these kinds of stories that ask questions of the world, is that if they are sufficiently compelling, if like Andre, you said you loved the Jack Reacher novels, right? Lee Child, like Lee Child is this master of just making you want to read the next sentence, making you want to turn the page, right? And like that power of stories to draw us in is, I think, a big part of what makes speculative fiction work, is that you're setting up these alternative interpretations of reality, these alternative futures that we might build toward or navigate between. And then they're embedded in narrative where they draw people in and make people want to share those stories, right? And that's the power. So when I work on a new story, I try to think of, I think about that question, the what if, and I went to a Socratic middle school when I was, 12 years old. And the really interesting part about like Socratic schools is that rather than like teaching you the answers, they just like challenge the kids with new problems that get harder and harder. So like in math class, they would like get us into groups and give us a question, and we'd come up with all these we'd fail a lot, right? So we'd like try to figure out the answer, not figure it out. But then eventually we would figure it out, and you're basically recreating the proof that they could have just written on the board in the first place, right? And I think that speculative fiction plays a similar cultural role. That when I start with that what if and I start playing with it, what I'm trying to do in writing a novel is not to provide an answer to that question, because if I knew what the answer was, I wouldn't be interested enough in it to write a novel. I'd just tweet it, right? Or do something else. I don't know. But if the question is sufficiently interesting, if it's sufficiently difficult to answer, where there's no black and white solution, where everything is sort of messy and complex and sort of like self-referential, that's where the only way I can hope to process it is by writing a novel about it, to play out those implications, to start throwing them into the mix and playing with each other. And so that's sort of where I go next. And I'd say the last sort of piece of that for me is you could do that in an essay, right? Like you could start with a question and start playing out, you know, the implications of it and go from there. And I love reading essays like that. But there's something special for me about doing it with fiction. And the thing that's special to me about doing it with fiction is that with fiction, you're embedding those ideas, which are really intellectual, in an actual human world. So you're taking whatever those what if concepts you had, and you're saying, well, like, how would this actually like change someone's life? Like, what would it mean, not just to like think about this as an idea, as a concept, but like, what would it mean when they go to the grocery store, or when they break up with their boyfriend, or when, you know, or when they lose someone they care about? Like, how do those clean, bright, exciting, big picture ideas intersect with like the messiness of human life and relationships? And how do those play out over time? That like causality of like, well, this happened and then that caused something else to happen, and all of those dominoes start to fall. To me, that's something special that fiction can offer, is that it's messy, it's embedded, it's contingent, and it invites you into another human's heart and mind, even if they're completely made up. So that's sort of where I go after that what if question.
I love that. I'm really glad I asked that, because I think one of the things that I felt like when I read Reaper, like specifically, was that I feel like there's a lot of sci-fi where you're like, oh, I get the point. Like, I get what I'm supposed to be worried about. I think I have a feeling maybe what I'm supposed to be doing, but I think now there's a lot more of this kind of, you know, writing and speculative fiction in yours definitely falls into this category where, and I think, I don't know, Parker, if after this you want to like elaborate, you put a link about this notion of just like, what, at least what I'm getting from the link you dropped is like just like that feeling that kind of like is enough, like that question is enough. I know this is not speculative fiction, but I remember this was made really salient like to me when I watched Everything Everywhere All at Once, and I didn't realize I was crying until after I was crying. And I think there's something really beautiful about, I mean, art in general, fiction, like of making, like you're interested, you're at the movies, you're reading the book, you're watching the show, whatever, like you're interested enough. But I think there's something really powerful, kind of as you're alluding to, Eliot, about just kind of like the emotion itself and like that response, like noticing where those biases are, noticing what you care about that you didn't realize you cared about, noticing that you do get anxious, or noticing that you feel calm, or noticing you feel exciting, and being able to like use just like the reading of the book, whether it's like a very reflective process and that's an active, or whether that's simply reading the book and then just realizing like, holy shit, wait, I care about that, or like that made me feel way more strongly than I thought. And that in and of itself, you know, then it's up to the reader to do what they want. But I think that there's a lot of power in that, and it's really exciting. But yeah, I don't know. I think yes, no spoilers. Promise.
Do you want, I mean, I can talk a little bit about that Rasa if you want. It's so the reason I put that in the chat is something that Eliot was talking about, that I came up in, like, I got a degree in anthropology like 10 years ago at this point. And one of my last kind of investigations was into this classical Hindu theatrical theory called rasa. And the idea behind this is supposed to be, it is what a lot of Bollywood is based off of, which is like creating an emotional space for within which the viewer employs and like feels their emotion. It's a big part of it. It's like, what is the framework around giving someone the feeling that they will feel? So in a big way, right? Like it's colors, facial expressions. Like if you look in that link, I actually didn't really look at the link. I just kind of like send it through. But back when I had done a lot of like study on it, it's like, you know, what facial expressions you're using, what body movements are you using, what does the dances in Bollywood films, right? Like, what are they really doing? They're telling you things. They're giving you an emotional space to explore. And it just sort of like, it's the opposite, I think, of what a lot of times can happen with Western creative writing, is to kind of like impose the emotion. Like, my character feels this way. It's like written that way. It's like they like, you know, it's very explicit. And instead it's like you kind of, you cradle like sort of a space within which like the viewer like comes to that conclusion themselves. And I find that like be extremely kind of compelling, because it allows people to explore where it is that they land in the experience of viewing or watching. I mean, like kind of thinking about these two things in the same kind of breath. Yeah, I mean, like I just think one of the things that you brought up as well, Eliot, was like this this idea of stories as like a compelling metaphoric vehicle. And one of the other things that like this is brought to mind is like this idea of like, and we don't talk about this enough just in general. I think stories are one of the most unique human tools. When we became the species that we did, the invention of the story is a fully unique phenomenon that does not exist in any other species. It allows us to transport ideas between generations. And so the ability to externalize that and put it into some other format, could be in writing, could be in cave paintings, could be, I mean, this is pretty speculative as well, but like could be in the night sky. That was the original library, was the night sky. To be able to tell these messages and transport them between generations, I think is like one of the most compelling human things. It's what makes us human. And so it's speculation allows us to like fill that space and feel cradled, I think, in a big way. It's very exciting. So yeah, I get, those are just the two things I wanted to comment on there.
I love that. I remember, oh man, who was it? I think it was Brian Eno, the electronic musician and artist, who he always explained that the way he looked at music was that it was a machine for making you feel things, right? That and he sort of used that to juxtapose the sort of I don't know, the cultural mythology around artistic creation as a musician, that like you're just waiting for the muse to come and then you just sort of have this magical riff and then you're good. That that he sort of looked at it in this very different way, which is like, no, I'm actually a tinkerer. I'm actually like building a little machine to make you feel something. And I've always felt that way with stories too, with any kind of art for that matter, that you're working to create the emotional space for the person receiving it, for the person experiencing it. I think that's a really beautiful concept. I'm excited to read up on the Wikipedia after we get off here. So thank you for sharing it.
And as a little like meta point also, if at any point you just want to unmute and say something and like start a discussion or like pick on a thread like and unravel like that's what we're here to do. So please like by all means like jump in, share anything and everything you want in the thread, unmute yourself to say whatever, ask whatever. Like that's what we're here to do. Yeah, I'm curious kind of with I feel like to kind of take that and bridge to another point. Parker mentioned like we are like one of the kind of like unique human things is this like storytelling ability, and like we have this ability like to tell these stories, specifically these like speculative futures. We have this ability to tell these stories, and we also have the ability, right, as you mentioned earlier, to kind of execute on those as well. And I'm curious about how you see I think a lot of kind of what you also explore in your writing, Eliot, is kind of how like sci-fi influences, like what actually happens like in technology and how like current technology actually influences sci-fi. I mean, a lot of people, I think it's funny because both like a compliment and a criticism of somebody like Elon Musk, for example, is they're like, oh, he just rips everything from sci-fi and then just like does the sci-fi thing, and then sci-fi just serves Elon, and it's kind of like this cycle. And I think present day especially, we see just how much kind of like this fiction kind of like impacts not just like the public perception, I guess, of technology, but also what people fund, what people choose to work on. And so we have this ability to tell kind of like powerful stories, but then those stories ultimately like really influence public perception and actual like money and things that get created. And I'm curious kind of, I mean, that's a very kind of loose starting point, but I'm curious if that triggers anything for you, if there's anything kind of there that you want to explore.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a big one. There's a really rich and complicated feedback loop between the stories we tell about possible futures and the actual future we build for ourselves, the actual future that arrives, right? And I find it pretty endlessly fascinating. So I really talk about it forever, but maybe like a few fun starting points for the group would be, first of all, that like there's a long history of this. Like it's not just Elon. They're like for decades and decades and decades, these kinds of like stories imagining possible futures have been read by in the US, like presidents and the Security Council, the military regularly commissions, like basically like think tank groups that include science fiction authors. Like Elon himself was really inspired by Kim Stanley Robinson's Red Mars trilogy, but like Stan like can't stand Elon and like thinks that he's like totally hijacking like and like misinterpreting everything that Stan wanted those books to, right? So it's like that's part of like the interesting bit. And I think part of it is that like like if you want to build a future, you sort of have to imagine it first, right? You have to like think about how, like if you can imagine how the world could be different or better, like that's a great starting point for trying to close the gap, trying to go from here to there. And I think that Parker, the example you mentioned of, again, Stan, like working on you called it regenerative finance, right? That you have this group that's like trying to like develop and make real some of the ideas from the Ministry for the Future. That's a great example of like these two halves of the coin sort of working together. My wife works for Pachama, which is sort of the leading, that they do carbon credits and like carbon credits are a whole big topic in themselves. And there's a lot of like, just like any new financial instrument, there's a lot of Wild West behavior in the space, but Pachama is doing really amazing work, like using satellite data to map existing biomass in rainforests. And then how do you use that to mint credits off of it so that we can make sure those forests are protected? They are super influenced by people like Stan, like Richard Powell, like all of these books that are imagining, oh, what if the systems that we live within worked differently? Where can we find points of leverage? Where can we find human agency, with these big problems? So I think that there's a lot there. And like, I've worked on various projects, like beyond the novels, like I've participated in tons of foresight workshops, right? With policymakers and journalists and companies. I've written commissioned science fiction stories for Fortune 100 executive teams where they're like hiring McKinsey to say, what should you do in the next 10 years? And then they hire a science fiction writer like me to blow it up, to write a story about how the future will be totally different from that and totally reframe all of the charts that are just basically projecting forward past trends. So I think there's a really rich feedback loop there where writers like me are inspired and curious about what people are actually building and use that to invent these new made up worlds, these made up futures. And then some people engage with those features and it informs what they build. But then, so it keeps going. One of like the really sort of basic, or I don't mean basic in the sense of unsophisticated, I just mean it in the sense of fundamental. But I remember listening to an interview with one of the sort of world's leading paleontologists. He discovered the largest dinosaur currently, I guess, that we know of, right, in southern Argentina. And I remember him saying that he loves the movie Jurassic Park. And the interviewer was like, I mean, come on, you're a paleontologist, like, aren't there like a million problems with that movie, right? Like, couldn't you like literally at every moment in the movie be like, well, that's wrong, they don't have feathers, but that's whatever, right? All of these things. And he's like, oh, of course, right? Like, of course I could do that, but you don't understand. Every single postdoc in my lab became a paleontologist because they watched Jurassic Park, right? Like, that was their gateway. That's what got them excited about it, got them starting to work on those problems. And to me, I find that really exciting. Like, my favorite thing in the world is when I hear from readers who are like, oh, I read whatever, like Cumulus, like Andre, right? And now I'm working on this nonprofit or this research initiative, or it made me think of this, or now we're doing this at, this new product we're building, or this whatever. Like, those are I could never have anticipated the things that people do, like with those stories off the back end. And that's what makes it so fun. So I think that's a piece of that feedback loop that I find particularly beautiful, is where, like, these kinds of stories can be the starting point. They can be a spark that then you go deep, right? Like Travis, Travis was mentioning geoengineering. My previous novel, Veil, plays with that idea and extrapolates it out. And I remember I got an email from the previous Assistant Secretary for Climate at the UN. And he was like, I've sent this book to all of our staff, and we're now, like we all need to read it together, because that gets us thinking differently on like how to make international, like how to write treaties to govern solar geoengineering. That's where I think those things can be helpful, where it's really different. Like when you read a story or when you watch a movie like Jurassic Park, it's really different than like reading like the report that the paleontologist who actually was discovering the dinosaur writes for his peers or her peers. So anyway, that's what that sort of makes me think about. But that feedback loop is super rich, and I feel like everyone on this call is participating in it. Like this, like that's what this conversation is. So I'd love to hear what other people think, or like experiences you've had where you've worked on projects where that played a role.
So,
Yeah, go ahead, Nikki. Sorry, go ahead. No, you go ahead. I've already spoken. Go ahead.
No, I was just gonna, while you were talking, it made me think of a tweet that Visa Camp, if you're familiar with him, had tweeted about, like, the things you joke about sort of shape your reality, and I associated that, like, write about the realities you want to see or could see, or and there's, even if loads of people wrote science fiction, there's so many realities which are going to happen which haven't been written about, that just come from reading it. So yeah, and there's like another thing that came to mind was a lot of Maltese people, and there's a couple of papers back from like the 1980s. Like, as a culturally, we don't ask questions. So I mean, more people should read like speculative fiction, because maybe they would start asking a few more questions. Yeah, you can mention what you were going to mention, Parker.
Yeah. So a theme that I kind of started thinking about earlier this year, when I really started thinking about, like, what is crypto really? Like, what am I participating in terms of this industry? Because obviously the public perception is off. I got this sense that there's a like the narrative shift that all of society needs is to move away from this a narrative of feeling that you're not in control. And I find that a lot of speculative fiction and a lot of science fiction that people tend to sort of focus on is the dystopias, right? Like the outcomes over which you have no control, the outcomes over which, and like the core theme there in my mind is really this theme of control. It's how much control do you have over the outcome? In 1984, like, you know, it's like this great society that is in control of your thoughts. In Fahrenheit 451, it's over the production of knowledge. In Cormac McCarthy's The Road, it's like the massive nuclear disaster that you had no control over preventing. And so the great hopeful thing is to be able to live in the ashes. So there's a lot of these narratives that kind of explore this. And we mentioned it a number of times already in the salon, but I really just think it's super compelling. Without giving away the ending to Ministry for the Future, like it ends very positively. And that doesn't necessarily happen sometimes, right? And I think that the most compelling thing you can do, and I know there's obviously like this dialectic around what a utopia is, because a utopia can be exclusionary, and utopias were in some ways born to be exclusionary, and there's probably many utopias, but like to write a narrative towards a collective utopia is, I think, one of the most compelling things that we can do, like as a society, to build a narrative around the possibility of not being without control. Like we do have control over the outcome. We do have control over what can happen next and what we can prevent. And to me, that's like the power of the story, the power of like speculation is like to look at the potential that comes from whatever it is you're working on, whatever it is you want to be a part of, and say, I believe that we have the control to make this happen. Even Elon Musk, it's the same thing, right? He's like, I believe we can back up the human hard drive. I believe that I can get us to be an interplanetary species, so that if an asteroid hits the planet and everyone on Earth is dead, at least we have a backup of the human species on Mars. But he believes that very consciously. And that's like one of the most inspiring things about him. Like, say everything you want about everything else that he is, right? Like money seems to corrupt people, but like, to me, that's really, I think it gets at the core of a lot of like why it is that narrative and like being like into thinking about speculation is so valuable, is because if you can sculpt an initiative around speculating an outcome, you can inspire people to move toward it. And then that way you're not living in an idea, this reality where you're hypothesizing about not having control.
I really love that. One of the things I'm always delighted by is I've had reviewers who review the same novel, and some describe it as dystopian and others describe it as utopian. And that makes me really happy when like people can't, like when everyone sort of like can't figure it out or has their own interpretation. But what that reminds me of is a book I read really recently that I highly recommend and made a really big impression on me, is Octavia Butler's The Parable of the Sower. It's so good. And one of the things that's so fascinating about this story is that it's set in like Southern California, basically LA, and the San Fernando Valley. And it is the most brutal, violent, dark dystopia you could imagine. It's basically like the modern civilization falls apart, and like literally roving bands of people are murdering and raping each other and stealing everything and just trying to survive. It is like the darkest possible setting for a story you could imagine, and really graphic. Like, she does not pull punches. Like, this is real. However, I found it to be one of the most utopian books I've ever read. And the reason is that the main character, the protagonist of this story, is just so profoundly like motivated to like build something new from the ashes that she's born into, that no matter like Octavia throws the kitchen sink at her. I mean, it is like her life is just terrible, and yet she is just this profoundly optimistic human who is not wearing rose tinted glasses, right? Like, she does not hide from the ugliness and pain around her, and yet she is unbelievably compelled to find ways to make that situation better, not just for her, but for others, for the people in her life, to build a new community from scratch. And I found it to be really moving. And I think it was like, for me, it was a big reminder that like utopia is internal, right? Like utopia is not like, if you watch a movie, it can be easy to say, like, you could take a still shot of the screen and be able to say, is this Avatar or is it the Hunger Games? Like, either you're right, it's like one or the other. And you could just tell from like the color palette and like the widgets that like you could identify on the screen. But I don't actually think that's true. I don't think that that's a true cross section. The only way to figure out whether it's like utopia or dystopia is how humans are acting across time to make that, to have agency in that world, whether you're acting out of selfishness and fear and short-sightedness, or out of generosity and kindness and compassion. And I feel like that the parable of the sower is just such a beautiful like example of that. Like quickly became a favorite speculative novel of mine. Anyway, I think that tension between utopia and dystopia and sort of the internal world and the external world is really interesting.
Yeah, it makes me think about the idea of like a socio-technical vanguard, which I just sent myself a link. I'm going to put it in the chat. It's like a nerdy academic article, but it's not too long. And it's about like groups of people, like biohackers, for instance, who might want to get together and try and design and kind of project their own vision of a utopia on other people. And it's kind of like everything, like every science fiction novel in a way is like its own vanguard, and it gets a readership and people start to enjoy it. And then it's like, you know, something the size of Cryptonomicon where people want to really realize that into life. So it's interesting because I view stories as something that I feel like can potentially open up people's eyes, like you were saying, Eliot, give people like the emotional space to think about these things, and can almost create a vision of a utopia where there was nothing. Like it's not like we have like this one world and there's like only so much land to build on. Like our minds are limitless space in a way. So we can kind of just grow this new vision in a different area that was never there. And that to me is like one of the really fascinating things about story, and maybe one of the things that's also dangerous about it.
I think I love all of this. I think so much of it is like tying back to kind of Eliot, what you were talking about earlier, also about like that first kind of like question that we spoke about like cognitive estrangement and like making things different enough where like it gets, you know, like it gets people thinking, and that kind of making the world, or maybe like again that being like there's a truth in terms of that being kind of a way to kind of remind people, or at least kind of like latently suggest like, oh, the world is malleable. I think that's something that's like really exciting. I'm excited for more and more. I think this is happening more in like certain children's movies. I think in the you linked that really great Substack, the No Opinion, about like world
yeah.
building in the event description. Go to the event description. There's this beautiful thing about world building, and there's, you know, San Fran Tokyo, you know, it's, I think there's this like children's movie, and it's set in this very like solar punk Tokyo, San Francisco kind of crossover. And what kind of we're all discussing about is making me excited, not just for like overt, like here's what the future could be, but stories that simply take place in, whether it's a solar punk future, you know, just normalizing like different possible futures just as the settings for regular old stories, and just having more and more. Like that is something that really excites me, just in terms of whether it's a conscious realization for people, but at the very least like latently like reminding people, kind of like to Parker's point and to Eliot's kind of earlier point, that like there is like power to be had. There is some sort of control there. Like the world is malleable. Like there are like choices that kind of go into that. It can be difficult, I think, sometimes, because on the one hand, I think there's you know, you have this malleability, but then also this kind of sense of, at least right now, the sense of like overwhelm and the sense of powerlessness. And, you know, you have these companies, like I think a lot about the metaverse announcement, yeah, or like that like hour and a half long Connect metaverse kind of video where Mark Zuckerberg is, it's kind of like a speculative, it's kind of like a movie. It's kind of like, look at this future, and this is a company that is doing both the job of like, look what the future could be, but then also is seen as kind of this, not necessarily like representing necessarily what the rest of us might want for the future. It's seen as this, you know, like very profit oriented, evil, some might say, you know, like company like with these, you know, very, very negative lenses. And so I'm curious kind of like how you reckon with, kind of building off of this conversation, how we all reckon with, you know, Eliot, all of us, how we all reckon with this feeling of, on the one hand, like I totally resonate with what Parker's saying about, and what Eliot mentioned about, right? Like the world is malleable, like we have power, there are things that can be done. Like the world up until this point has been actively shaped by like choices, and it can continue like to be actively shaped by choices, and we have that power. But at the same time, I think there is this feeling, maybe it's from like, you know, certain dystopian literature. We have our own Black Mirrors, we have like a whole, you know, century at least of dystopian literature, but also in general, this general sentiment of feeling powerlessness at like who gets to perhaps like make those choices. And like there's some of us who can write these stories like Eliot, but who actually, you know, gets to put them kind of into play and into action. So anyway, that was a little bit of a spiel, but I don't know, that clearly it brings up a lot for me, a lot of like tension, a lot of like frustration. I'm curious kind of like what that catalyzes in other people.
I mean, when I think about it, like, I think that, I mean, we were just talking about power, right? Like that we have to remember that we all have power, whether it's the power to make up a different story, or to make a decision in a job tomorrow, or what to study in school, or what to encourage in a friend, right? Like we have power, but like power is very much two-sided, right? Like there's the promise of using that power well, using that power in a way that you're going to be happy with later. But like, you know, there is as much danger as there is promise, right? Like like anyone with power, whether it's a really small thing, like which milk you're getting from the grocery store, or whether you're like a lawmaker writing a new policy, like your decisions are going to have consequences that just ripple out from that action. And I think it's important to remember that we have power, to remind ourselves that we have agency, that we aren't passive observers to history. But part of the realization of agency is being really cognizant and aware of the dangers of exercising that newly found sense of power, right? I mean, it's really, it's a challenge. And I feel like if you think about things sort of broadly, and, you know, the sort of tagline for Reaper that's like on our like posters and things like that is like, how far would you go to achieve your greatest ambition, right? And like in the story, there are podcasters and quantum computer scientists and assassins and, you know, investors, like people who all are seeking toward, you know, like they each have a vision they're reaching for. And the story plays with exactly that, Mariel, that like exactly that tension between promise and danger and what those trade-offs are. And I think that like as a species, one thing that's really interesting about like where we are right now, if you think like an anthropologist and you think about this historical moment, is that all of these amazing tools that we've invented for ourselves, like everything that we call technology, like inventing ways to do things better, those things increase our power, right? Like Genghis Khan could order his generals to order their, direct reports, to order the soldiers to pour silver into the ears of prisoners of war, molten silver, right? Like terrible things. But even Genghis Khan like couldn't explode a nuclear bomb that would like make a whole region unlivable for a long time. In the same way, like we're able to produce so much more food, right? Like a couple centuries ago, 98% of the human population worked in agriculture. Now it's actually the exact opposite, 2% do, right? So like we've increased the power, our leverage in the world, like human leverage in the world, which means that each of our decisions about what we buy at the grocery store or what we push for in that initiative of work, where we donate money to support what causes, whatever, that each of those decisions now has more weight than at any other point in human history. And I think that's really fascinating because basically it means that the more that technology advances, the more power we invent for ourselves, the more how the world changes over time becomes a question of internal human morality. Because suddenly, if we're the ones making the decisions, and every decision now has more like higher stakes than it did in the past, human choices, how humans arrive at the choices they wind up making becomes like fundamental to what future we build for ourselves. It, even more so than 100 years ago, 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, that like we're sort of narrowing in the focus on actually human psychology, on human nature, and being like, it's like we're like ramping the volume up to 11 on human nature. And so we almost have to be, even as we investigate the external world and build those new tools, we need to bring that same level of focus and discipline to the internal world, to introspection, right? To understand how we arrive at those choices. And you're never going to be able to make the best decisions all the time. But if we can get to, 51% promise, 49% danger, like at least that 1% maybe will compound over time. That's how I think about it. But I'd love to hear what others have to say.
Yeah, I think one of the big things that comes to mind here is like I raised this idea of like control, right? Like what you have control over and inspiring people to have control. But the point you just made that I think is really like valuable, and I'm still like kind of orbiting around it, is that we actually have a ton of control, but it's really a question of who's in control, right? And so in a lot of like, I think dystopias that kind of emerge from us speculating about the future, it's like, oh, like some people are in control and the rest of us don't have it. And so like maybe the shaping of the narrative. So I shared something in the chat as well. Like there's a VC firm in crypto called eGirl Capital that does some great writing and explored this concept of like, what is lunar punk versus solar punk? Yeah, we brought up solar punk a couple times in here. And solar punk is this vision of this like perfectly cooperative future with this like beautiful verdant partnership between nature and humans and all this different stuff. And lunar punk is kind of like, well, we might not have that much control, but we can make our islands of calm. And I think that's also kind of interesting. It's like somewhere between a dystopia and a utopia is like, you can create your own utopias. And maybe that's all you have control over. Maybe we all have to go try to live in Gibraltar and live in our own like little islands of calm. That's what we do actually have control over. And so maybe that's like I think what I find really compelling is this idea of like looking at the immediate present and what it is that you have control over and trying to explore in that direction, rather than being like, how do I change the whole world? You know, because that can be really overwhelming and probably difficult to achieve.
Travis, I'd be really curious to hear how, like, you know, strategic foresight, part of the whole idea is that you're exploring the possibility space in a really rigorous way to inform high stakes decisions in the present, right? Like ultimately that work helps lay a map that people use to navigate forward. How do you think about this? When you think about the impact of your work and how it intersects with the decision makers you're seeking to empower, like what comes to mind? How does that get messy when the rubber really hits the road in the real world for you?
I think there are a few things that I'll mention, kind of also coming back to things that came up earlier in the discussion when I was sort of here. One is, I think this tension around agency with respect to the future is something that's very real. And people, I think, fall along a spectrum in terms of how they feel about that. But typically when you're engaging them around something in a professional context, they'll kind of fall into one of two buckets, right? Either the future is something that happens and we just don't have much control over it, and so we need to prepare for it. So it's all risk, basically, right? And then there are others who are like, well, we can shape the future, right? We can create our own destiny. And so it's all opportunity in terms of how you direct the organization. And so playing with groups of people who have different mindsets, right, in different parts of an organization gets really interesting in that way. And at the end of the day, it's kind of a mix of both, right? And I think where I'm starting to head with practicing foresight is a lot more, I guess, Taoist philosophically in a way, in that I'm pushing for a recognition and acceptance of complexity, right? Where there's not sort of a black and white, like you can control it fully or it's completely out of your control, right? There's something in between. And so in creating visions of the future and creating scenarios, what I'm wanting to do with people is basically figure out how to simulate them, how to put people into the shoes of being characters in those futures. The way that I landed on this, like literally, I think just last week, this idea that by creating more and more future scenarios, we're creating a lot of interesting game boards, but then we never play the game. Right. And so how can we help people to actually play the game of being in the future and actually going, oh, that's interesting. Like that challenges some values that I've held for a long time. And I've never questioned, you know, why do I hold those values? Which is a combination of multiple things, including where someone is born and the time period and all of that. Right. And when we start thinking about a long-term future, I mean, the only guarantee is that values will continue to change. Really. And so how do you just help make that real for people in a way that they have a more sort of visceral experience with the future, that allows them to, I guess, hold different ideas as more plausible than saying, oh, that's very speculative. Let me suspend my disbelief a little bit, and maybe the details of that future aren't going to come true, but the values, the way that society decides to organize and interact with the futures, those things might actually, there might be insights there. So
that reminds me of the best job I had in high school, which is there was a teacher I grew up in Oakland, California, and there was a local public school teacher who taught math. And she was basically sick of the curriculum that the district handed her, because basically kids got bored and it was really hard to keep them engaged and teach them math. So she started inventing a role-playing game that the kids would play, where she would like create the rules such that, say you want to throw a grappling hook, right? You actually have to like do multiplication and division to like see if the grappling hook sticks, right? And then as the kids got older and would go from grade to grade, she would increase the complexity to match to give them the right level of challenge. And because to take that grappling hook example, like she would start using actual physics, right? So like suddenly both the math would get harder, but it wasn't just arbitrary math. It was actually around like, okay, like let's learn about gravity, right? And so she eventually, left the school and started this as like her own little small business, like a private program that was like running these role-playing games. And like, oh my God, in terms of world building, like by the time I was a kid playing, it was like way beyond Marvel, like in terms of like the level of depth and like the amount, like just incredible. Like I just wish there's some producer gets their hands on this and starts to actually use it, because it's just such an amazing world. But like I played as a kid and it was really fun, and she ran like summer camps and programs, and then would run like after school things during the year. And then when I got into high school, I started running games for her. So I would like have my own group, and we'd have like a whole bunch of parallel groups running with like 6 kids playing. And it was really extraordinary as the person, as the host, as the game master, to see the changes that it made in those kids' lives. A lot of kids who were really struggling in school would do the obvious thing where they would just like master these concepts better, right? So like that's sort of like straightforward. That's why she developed that in the first place. But what was even much more interesting, and this was very visibly true for kids who had learning disabilities, or were anywhere on the spectrum, or anything like that, but also true of like all of the kids, was how much it changed their social interactions. That by actually playing through adversity, like where they were actively involved, rather than watching a movie, like Travis, as you were saying, rather than sort of like just thinking through a scenario, right? Like just looking at the map, the experience of safely, like not actually needing to go through it, but like having a safe space where you could pretend your way through it, where you actually were like putting yourself in your imagination in that world, in that situation, and needing to play out the consequences, gave them just a tremendous amount of confidence in how they then dealt with the real world. And I've always felt, because I've been a participant in a bunch of like sort of these gaming, like perspective, foresight gaming exercises with various organizations. I've always felt that it would be much like even more effective if it really was treated as a role-playing game, where people were embedded in the scenario and needed to play it out themselves, rather than just seeing it or like, seeing it presented. And so anyway, I really love that. And you threw me back a couple decades.
Yeah, no, you went into a million incredible places. I think earlier on with what you were saying, Eliot, you were reminding me I have a friend who works for this like future of storytelling publishing house. There's no paper, it's like not books, but they do a lot of very like interactive kind of storytelling, a lot of digital storytelling. And I know that you have experimented also and done a lot of really cool stuff with just like new forms of storytelling. I think I also read that you did, was it like a kind of like a 2016 election kind of a related game, or just like worked on things like that. And I'm curious, I feel like sci-fi and speculative fiction, and just like the future of storytelling kind of just beyond. I mean, I need like a book. I need a physical book at the end of the day. Like that is my happy place, that I will always need that more than anything else. And I think we're getting really innovative, whether it's like through VR or like AI, all these different, there's so many new ways to kind of like tell stories and engage people. I'm curious if you and like Travis, if there's anything, whether it's like technology or any like modes, is there anything that you all have seen kind of similar to what Eliot was saying, within the speculative fiction or sci-fi realm, or within this like new age of storytelling that feels like it is kind of like engaging around these ideas? You mentioned kind of, you know, this teacher, but I'm curious if is there anything that exists right now in speculative fiction? And I imagine if it's going to pop up anywhere, it's going to be around climate stuff, but like anything where like technology or new forms of storytelling maybe are like making these kinds of stories, like you said, like more visceral, or reframing them at least.
You mean in terms of like different mediums, like how
Yeah,
people are
maybe in
experimenting
terms
with
of different mediums, in terms of kind of
Mm.
like you said, like role playing. I'm curious if there's anything that's happening now in that kind of like more immediate, maybe like gamified, visceral, interactive kind of realm of storytelling around speculative fiction and different futures.
Yeah, I mean, I can give a few examples. I'd be really curious to hear what others have to say. Terry Pratchett, who writes these amazing fantasy books, and like if you want fantasy that like riffs on the real world and is super speculative, could not recommend his Discworld books more. They're incredible. But he always liked to say that books are sharks, that basically they're a technology that works really well. Like sharks have been around a long time, and being a shark continues to be the best way to be a shark, right? Like they may be at a local maximum, but that local maximum, it has a really strong chance of survival. And that books are similar, like as a form, like a piece of technology, like I mean, it doesn't need a power source, right? Like you can stick it on your shelf. You remember it's there. They can last a long time, especially if you protect them even a little bit. So books work really well. But it's important to remember that like books are pretty recent. Like we've had books for a couple hundred years. Like even the form of like a novel, it came well after like the printing press. Like as a convention, as you have like a written prose story that's a couple hundred pages long, that like that as a social convention took a while to develop, and I think that like it's still going very strong. So like interestingly, a lot of people have predicted like the end of the book or like the death of books for a long time, and like with the internet, with every new development, people are like, oh, well, this is no one is going to read books anymore. And of course, like both print book sales have just continued to go up. Like print book sales are higher now than they ever have been before. And then ebook and audiobook sales are like a totally new market on top of print book sales. It did not cannibalize them, which is really surprising and defied most people's predictions. So it's I find that sort of interesting. But I think there are tons of really new, cool ways that people are experimenting. I mean, obviously a huge one is like computer and video games. Like that's a totally new format in the past couple decades that has just been in just an ongoing renaissance, right? Of like totally like creating a new way to interact with stuff. And to play with virtual worlds. I think there are really interesting intersections there too, where like, if any of you guys watch The Mandalorian, which is like the Disney Plus Star Wars series, they actually use the Unreal Engine, like the video game engine and initially they had the stage set up for actors in the show, and they put these huge screens surrounding the stage. And initially it was only for the actors. So the actors were there, supposed to be on a desert planet with spaceships landing or whatever. And one of the problems when you have actors against a green screen is that they don't know where the horizon is, right? So normally when you're standing in the world, everyone knows where the horizon is. But when you're an actor against a green screen, you have no way to know. And it turns out that like it looks super awkward if like however people's eye movements work, if people don't have a shared view of the horizon, apparently it looks weird, right? So filmmakers worry about this. And they created all of these massive screens and started displaying a virtual world of like Tatooine or whatever desert planet they were supposed to be on, so that the actors could feel embedded and that they would have the right horizon line. And then when they were reviewing footage before post-production, they were like, actually, this looks really good. I don't know that we need to replace all of the backgrounds with post-production. And so they started using the footage of actors acting in front of a screen displaying a virtual world built on a video game engine as the show that you watch, right? And there are just so many fascinating examples of that, where I know that some of the big design engineering firms are now using video game engines to build virtual airports. And then Parker, you were mentioning complexity theory using what's called agent-based modeling to actually like simulate out like how those airports are. So it's not just like an architectural blueprint. You actually have a simulated airport and see how it functions and where problems might spin up as little virtual people are like traveling through this virtual world. So I feel like there are really tons of weird and like fascinating ways in which these kinds of things are evolving. And I'd love to hear examples, because I'm sure people here have stumbled across some weird stuff that I've never heard of before.
So just to continue what you were talking about, 3D engines, a lot of companies in the autonomous car space use them to build their simulation environments and simulate edge cases and all that fun stuff. I've seen a healthcare company build a hospital basically, and use it to simulate like, should this room be here, and like the flow to the corridors and all that stuff too. Those are two things that came to mind.
Mm-hmm.
I would almost argue that there are two sort of parallel trends that have not quite intersected yet. And I'd love to hear if there are examples of the intersection that I'm not aware of. But I think on the one hand, there's this push for like very sort of ultra real simulation, right? Which is very cool, but I see that very often disconnected from really good storytelling that I find more often in indie video games that are not the best graphics, right? And so I would be really interested in seeing the convergence of those two things and where that leads. Because the game that came to mind is one that I haven't finished yet. I don't know if anyone's heard of this, Disco Elysium.
Mm-mm.
Really fascinating game that is, it's sort of a point and click adventure. And at first I was kind of like, okay, I've played point and click RPGs before and that's fine. The decisions matter so much. And the level of storytelling is just incredible. And through it, you make decisions that also determine your set of values and like your political alignment. And so there's something in there around, okay, you're making decisions as this character that sort of will open doors and close others through time. And that's where I think you have that replayability. When I think back to how I'd like to use this professionally, right? That like, okay, make decisions and be okay with making decisions, because to your point, it's in a safe space. You can make the wrong decision. You can take a role that might be a little bit provocative and see how that plays out, and then go back and make different decisions the second and third time through. But yeah, for me, I have not yet seen really compelling sort of both hyper realistic and really good storytelling examples in video games.
If I can just add to that. So I feel like I've done some work in my bachelor's in computer graphics and photorealistic light reflection modeling. And I think a lot of the times the more photorealism applications are like technical demos, they're like hardware demos, software demos. Whereas, I mean, both my computer graphics supervisors love storytelling. They play D&D, but they're usually like, you see photorealism in a lot of demos nowadays. But I mean, like with the PS5 and Unreal Engine 4 or 5, whichever the latest one is, there's a lot of improvements as well. But and something else that came to mind is, I don't know if you guys have been seeing like DALL-E 2 or like these image generation tools. But a couple of days ago, Google dropped a blog post where they took like these, they came out with a photorealistic image generation tool basically. So it's taking these tools which till now have generated like more fantastical and not like physically plausible images, and they're exploring that space. So that's cool, worth checking out. It's called Imagine. I'll drop it in the chat.
It's really exciting to see how like tools like that and just kind of I spent a couple months learning from somebody, not really retaining much because this is my field, but who is in the field of just like AI generated art, and it is very much just like remixing, kind of like what Eliot was saying earlier, and I think it's beautiful. I think one of the things that's really exciting to me, especially when I first like saw like friends starting like playing with DALL-E and like Twitter was like full right of just people putting like prompts and things, is just the ability for tools like that to like just remind us again like of all of these possibilities, and to just like with the stroke of a few keys give us such like rich, and I mean really like rich, intricate like visual right inspiration, to whether it's like to add to storytelling or again to like be this kind of like way to remix to make us kind of, you know, reframe and rethink the world that we're seeing, because all it uses is stuff that's kind of already been fed to it, and even if the stuff that's been fed to it right is like kind of like already imagined in some way, I think it's exciting right to see these technologies, whether it's like books and speculative fiction, or whether it's I guess like the speculative fiction of like DALL-E generation of just like taking things that are like that exist, that are around, and remixing them and like regurgitating and representing them to us in new ways that like inspire and excite and reframe. I want to mention really quickly, we are at time. I'm more than happy to go over. I don't know if Eliot has time. We can, you know, we can hang around, but I just want to be respectful of, you know, if you have to leave, if this is a hard stop for you at 4. Right,
I can stay on for an additional 10 minutes, but then I've got to go.
All right.
And I just dropped you guys made me think of this, but I dropped a fun little link into chat. John Carmack shared a quote from Reaper, making him think about DALL-E 2. So I was like, oh my God, this is a good cross-sectional thing here. Anyway, yeah, I can stay on for another 10 minutes for if folks have more questions or we want to keep chatting, and then I've got to run.
Yeah, I actually have to run, but I just wanted to thank you for putting together this salon. It was really wonderful. It was nice to explore a lot of these concepts. Wish I could stay longer.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you for participating, and all thanks go to Mariel. I'm just along for the ride like you guys.
Oh no. Thank you to both of you.
Before you leave really quickly, if there's any, you know, if y'all want to stay in touch, if Twitter handles are like a thing that you want to share, again, we will be saving the chat and you all will receive it. So any way to like, you know, if you want to stay in touch, if you want to share, you know, how to reach out to y'all. If you're not already a member, like part of the Discord, that is also like a beautiful, beautiful space where we can all interact and things will be uploaded and shared there. I highly recommend it. But thanks again, Parker, for coming. Cool. I guess my last kind of like parting question, at least for you, Eliot, kind of as we wind down, is I'm curious, like what, I feel like we like, obviously like speculative fiction, sci-fi goes through phases. We have like utopianism, we had dystopianism, we have like all these kinds of different flavors. Now where I feel like there's so much like branching like happening. I'm curious if there's anything that you feel like is an undercurrent, something that's going to be like the next big thing in sci-fi, you know, what hasn't made it to like the movies yet, you know what I mean? Like I think you go from like the books to the mainstream, like more movies, like these big mass things. I'm curious as like as a devourer of speculative and sci-fi, is there anything that's exciting you or that you feel could be really, you know, the next big thing in like sci-fi?
Sure. Yeah, I'd say I have sort of two things there that might be interesting to folks. So the first is one of the beautiful things about text as a medium, about writing, is that it's really cheap, right? So if you're making a movie, I mean, like a big budget movie can cost $200 million to make. Same with a big budget series or a AAA video game, right? Like, I mean, any of these are huge collective efforts that require tons of resources, teams of people. And whenever humans are collaborating on that kind of scale, there is just tons of oversight, right? Like you're like, you know, well, who's financing the thing? Do they approve X, Y, or Z, right? Like you have all of those kinds of questions. And I love the results often. I mean, I love movies. I love watching cool series. They tend to hew closer to like a mainstream set of social norms, because by definition, like if you have $100 million on the line, people are really concerned that they'll get it back, right? And from my perspective, one of the really cool parts about books is that, I mean, really by far the biggest cost of writing a book is the author's time, right? I mean, what else is like pretty much any, like you have a computer, you could even write a book on paper, right? If you wanted to, anyone can participate in that medium in a way that, yeah, you can make a YouTube video, but you can't participate in big budget filmmaking in the way that Hollywood can. And so I think that one of the things I like so much about reading as experiencing prose as an art form is that it can be so much more experimental. It can explore so many different weird places in human psychology, and that like you can have so much more personality imprinted on it, that like, you know, as the author, I mean, you're really reading like their work in a way that is pretty rare in filmmaking. It's possible, but it's hard because it's this huge human collective effort. And so I think that's one of the things I like so much about reading speculative fiction, is that you can have these like totally weird stories that don't seem like they would lend themselves to other formats. And sometimes those get adapted in amazing ways, right? Like Ted Chiang's story, The Story of Your Life, was adapted into the movie Arrival. I mean, like, when I first read that story years ago, there is no way I ever thought that would be adapted into a film, right? And like, same with like David Mitchell's Cloud Atlas, right? Like crazy speculative novel. Like it's one of those novels you read and you're like, this is one of my favorite books. It'll never be a movie. And the Wachowskis made it into one. But I think that's one of the unique strengths of prose fiction that's really cool and that I really appreciate. So that's one idea. And then the second idea is that I think that science fiction and speculative fiction as a literary genre has been around for a couple hundred years. You had some really early experimentation in the 17th century, and then it sort of came more into its own in the 19th century, like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, like this kind of stuff. And then obviously in the 20th century, you had like an explosion in science fiction. And in that explosion in science fiction, it was very tightly linked to like a lot of 20th century science fiction writers were literally friends with or in communities with like people working at NASA or early rocketry programs in Germany, as well as the US and in Russia. So you had this like sort of community of writers that were really interested in, were embedded in very particular technical communities. And those writers formed like a club, more or less, right? Just like any group of artists, like modernists are basically like talking to each other through the art, right? And like that was very true in science fiction. And that group of like the when science fiction became much more popular as a genre, and when the paperback book was invented, which relatively recent, it really took on its own in the 40s. That democratized reading as a pastime in a way it never had been before across all genres. And that's when science fiction really took off. So there was this initial group of authors like Arthur C. Clarke, Robert Heinlein, Asimov, like a lot of names that many people have heard of that were part of that like initial outpouring of like popularity in the genre. And for a while, that style, their style, dominated the scene. And I think that what's really exciting at this moment in terms of like speculative fiction as an art form is that there isn't a single new trend, that it's not that we're moving from dystopia to or whatever, like from one thing to another thing. The interesting part is that it's actually just becoming way more heterogeneous, that people who are writing and publishing science fiction are so much more diverse than they ever have been before. I mean, you can see this in like very visible ways, like for example, people who have won recent speculative fiction awards, like literally are different genders and different personal histories and different skin tones than like any past awards for the past 50 years, but also just that the stories people are telling because they grew up in rural Sri Lanka or they, whatever the personal background is, there's so much more diversity in the kinds of speculative fiction that are being told. And I think that's really exciting as a reader because it makes for many better, different stories that are fun to explore and to sort of like challenge and bend your mind. But it's also important for a reason that I think, Mariel, you brought up earlier when you were asking about almost like the consequences or implications of speculative fiction and the feedback loop with the real world, which is that like, who gets to decide? Who's it, right? Like who gets to decide? And now speculative fiction as a genre is like super culturally vibrant and diverse and dynamic in a way that it's never been before, which is part of why I'm so excited, why I enjoy like participating in it so much. It's like really a fun scene. So yeah, that's where I sort of see it.
Yeah, no, I think that's super true. And I think sci-fi especially lends itself towards a community of fans that are very online, a lot of like fan fiction, which I think used to be something we kind of looked down upon. Like,
sure.
But like one of my favorite books, There Is No Anti-Memetics Division, if you're familiar.
No, I haven't read it.
It's entirely fan fiction. It's a
cool
paperback book, but it has its own website, its own tome. I think I shared it here, but
awesome.
It's a book that is both a physical book and this like online community. And so much of sci-fi, I mean, like is like I think a lot of sci-fi and a lot of like new authors especially like start off just like whether it's blog posts or writing online or like in online forums. And there's something really exciting about just like this community specifically is pretty online and like the ways in which that lets like anybody write about anything in a way that like will be received by at least like some audience. So I think that on top of everything you said is just like doubly exciting for this genre like specifically. We are at and over time, so I'm gonna end this, but thank you all so much for showing up. Thank you, Travis, for doing two things at once at the beginning, and for folks over in Europe and other parts of the world just calling in. And I know it looks dark, it looks late, so thank you so much for letting us hold you for this time. And thanks mostly to Eliot for writing more than anything else, but also for being here. I will save this recording and I will save the chat and I'll send it all to everybody after this, and it'll be available like in the Intellect hub and like Discord within the next week. So just like a heartfelt warm thank you to all of you, and I hope we all get to see each other in another salon sometime soon.
And thank you, Mariel, again for bringing us together. This has been a real joy. I've loved learning from all of you, and this has been a really powerful experience. And Andre, I hope you enjoy the rest of Cumulus.
Yeah, thanks, man. This has been a real pleasure. Thank you.
All right.
Here's everyone.
Have a beautiful day.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.